It is good to continue on this character study of Moses. And again, I think just looking at these characters is interesting because we get to see God interacting with people. And then sometimes analyze our lives and see how he may interact with us. I think if we're really handling this the right way, we probably know what God's answer would be. Sometimes we think, oh, I wish I know what God would say. Well, there's just enough text there to where we've seen how he would respond. And I think that's true as we continue in the life of Moses, and we've gotten him where he started there in Egypt, and in many ways, an heir apparent to the throne in some capacity, but he refuses that. And we looked at that in Hebrews chapter 11, where he just went away from that life and went a different route. And I think the disappointing part of this is, if we were looking at it as part of our life, is he finds himself in a place where you're just like, ooh, it didn't get better, right?
Right.
He's
Yeah.
just out in the wilderness and alone, and then we've got God, coming to him.
Right.
And so tonight we get to talk about the part of his life where he's at that burning bush, And sometimes we talk about a come to Jesus moment, but probably in our lives we need a burning bush moment. I don't know how he could have forgotten that moment. So
yeah, for sure.
I'm
He
glad you're
recorded
here,
it.
Tim.
So,
I'm glad you're here, Tim, to kind of
Me
talk
too.
about that and guide us through this wonderful interaction that Moses gets to have with God through this burning bush here.
For sure, and a terrifying one too. Speaking of, and I love how you opened up with talking about how, a lot of times we wonder, what would God say, right?
Yeah.
What would God tell us to do? I think what we see through a lot of the life of Moses and many of the other characters is often, if it's the tougher thing to do or the scarier thing to do, that's probably what he would tell you to do, right? And the burning bush is definitely a prime example of that sort of thing. So like you said, we leave off here where we left off last time, and we're picking up where Moses is a 40-year-old man who just lost his life of royalty, right, and privilege, to go wander in the wilderness, right? And that's actually kind of a crazy theme you see throughout a lot of biblical characters, is there's sort of this period of having to give up, or being forced to give up, a comfortable scenario and have to step into the chaos of the wilderness. We saw that with Abraham, right? We saw that with Jacob. We see that with Noah, even in the flood, right? In a different kind of sense, but still chaos, right? Jesus, before his ministry, goes and fasts in the wilderness, right?
Yes.
John the Baptist was a guy who was in the wilderness. We see it with the prophets. We see this running theme throughout the Bible where often, and we can use this as a really kind of solid metaphor for maybe confusing directions our life tends to take sometimes, where it feels like we are in our own wilderness. Like that Moses ends up leading the Israelites before the promised land through the wilderness, right? Often there's these periods with the people God uses where nothing makes sense with what's going on. They seem stranded, right? They have picked up a job to get by as a shepherd oftentimes, right? But things are tough and things really don't make sense with how their life was supposed to turn out according to their own system, right? And their own trajectory. And that's definitely where we see Moses, right?
You got to see Moses here. There had to be a moment, and hopefully we're not reading too much in the scriptures, but there had to be a moment during this period before this burning bush where he wondered, where's God?
Right.
And I mean, really, he finds out.
Right? Yeah.
But I mean, he has to wonder, has God left me? Because it's so different than where he was, And I think that's, as you bring up that metaphor of life, a lot of times in that wilderness, sometimes we're thinking, where is God? And he's still the same God who says, I will never leave you.
Right.
And I will never forsake you, right? And so he's still there even in those wilderness moments.
Yes, exactly, yeah. And even though he's seemingly silent, so as far as Moses can tell, by the time he starts talking, right, as we'll see, maybe Moses wishes he had stayed silent a little bit at first, right? And that's kind of what we see. So we get to the very beginning of Exodus chapter 3. Moses is just at his day job again, right? He says Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law. So not only does he have a day job, but he's working for his father-in-law. Seen that a few times. It doesn't go all that well. Led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. So already that's attention getting, right?
Definitely.
And maybe there's a sort of metaphor in that, and I may be reading into this too much, I don't know. But even the idea of something being on fire without being consumed, right? That sort of becomes almost a metaphor of what God calls us to do with our own walk, for sure.
So that's the church right?
Yes.
You
Yes.
know, as I wish that you were either hot or cold, right? So he wants them on fire. He wants us on fire.
Oh yeah.
And then obviously, because he preserves us, we're not burned up.
Right.
We're just on fire.
Exactly. And that's exactly kind of what he's almost calling Moses to do here. And so Moses, he tunes in immediately to, this is significant, right?
Sure.
He says here in verse 3, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why this bush does not burn. It's like, okay, good step so far, right? He says, okay, I'll go check this out because this is clearly something different. And here's where it gets really weird for Moses. A voice comes out of the bush. God calls him from the midst of the bush and says, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. That's a good response.
Sure.
Because
Not sure how he responded so calmly.
right, exactly, yeah, and maybe it wasn't so calmly. I don't know. But here's an interesting thing God says here in verse 5. He says, do not draw near to this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. So now the emotional reality of what's going on hits him.
Right.
Not only is God's presence terrifying, but it demands a certain kind of reaction, right? Take off your shoes, which maybe seems like a strange thing, but it perhaps, at the very least, alludes to the idea that you got to be careful how you tread in the presence of God, so to speak, right? It's something to be approached with respect and maybe even a sense of delicacy, right?
Yeah.
Not in a sort of false ritualistic way, but in a way that is honest and vulnerable, right? And that's, I mean, that's, taking off your shoes is a, vulnerable thing to do in the
Very
wilderness,
much so,
right? It's
yeah.
Anyway, so take off your sandals is holy ground, and then he identifies himself, and immediately Moses is rightfully scared. We see that reaction a lot when people encounter the voice of God, or even with angels and things like that. So he identifies himself by his ancestors and everything. And then God tells us this. He says in verse 7, I have surely seen the oppression of my people here in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians. So that sounds great so far. And I know y'all talked about that some last time, but God not only listening to their cries, but he has this line here, I know their sorrows, right? There's a sense of empathy there that he is, that draws him to them. Right?
Well versed in their sorrows. Just, I think he intimately knows them because he says, I have seen the affliction. Like I've just witnessed it. And I think that's beautiful to think about how closely he's watching. There's other parts as we read this that he heard the cries. But here he sees it. And I have come down to deliver them. I think that's beautiful, that he's not a God who just allows you to suffer. He wants to deliver. Our God is a deliverer.
Yes.
And that's who he is.
Absolutely.
And so those same afflictions that we go through today, he witnesses and he wants to deliver.
Exactly. And so if you stop the story right there, it sounds like, okay, great. God's going to rope them all out. Go ahead. Go on, do that. That'd be great if you would do that. But then God keeps going. He has a certain way he's going to do that, right? He is a deliverer, but a lot of times he delivers in a way that we don't exactly expect, right?
He oftentimes uses us, though, as well.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I was getting to.
He's using Moses, and then, of course, the people are going to be challenged in such a way. But you even think about some of the salvation stories in the New Testament. As you think about Cornelius, God had a direct communication with Cornelius, the Gentile. And why wasn't he saved? That just through God. God used Peter. Why? Right. I don't know. God used Peter. Right. And the same thing with the Ethiopian eunuch. God used Philip. And so it's God still allows us through his grace, allows us to participate in our own deliverance at times, but also to aid in the deliverance of others.
Oh yeah.
And I just think that's gracious on God's account to give us that opportunity to serve. Because you got to think about this. I think Moses was willing to serve, and I know we're about to talk about that. Right. He was willing to serve. I think it was probably because, he did take off his shoes, and he turned, and he was scared of God. And so he wanted to serve, but he's like, whoa, wait a second, God. The way I want to, right?
Right. You've got the wrong guy for this resume.
I'm not really sure I want to serve the way you want me to. So, yeah, I think it's interesting to just see that what God demands, but also how he allows us to participate in the deliverance process.
For sure, and he even wants that, right? Like, and we talked about this before with even looking at Noah, right? It's like if you're going to save 8 people and all the animals, why have a guy build a boat for 100 years when you could just, do it yourself, right? And it's like, well, God wants a participation in the process of deliverance and restoration, and even
that generally creates a greater appreciation.
well, yes, and that's part of the point, right? Is that not only do we get to help him change the environment around us, but we also change as part of that process. And Moses sort of becomes the avenue for bringing Israel into that, because that was supposed to be their purpose in the world, right? And eventually, of course, Jesus, right? And this is a running theme we see constantly: is God has the ability to speak anything he wants to into being, right? That's the creation story, but he wants to use people, and it's why he wants a relationship with us so bad. It's not just, a lot of times we tend to see our relationship with God as something where we can get God to act on our behalf, right? And God does act on our behalf. But half the point, or more than half the point, really, of us communicating with God in the first place is not to change his mind on stuff, to bend it to our will. It's to change us, right? We pray and we read and we study to change ourselves, right? And we see Moses running up against that with the burning bush. And so, he has this whole spiel about, I've heard them. I'm sending them to a good land. I've made this promise that I'm going to keep. And, I've heard their cry. And then he says here in verse 10, come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the children out of Egypt? So here's where things take that turn that we're not expecting, right? It's like, okay, great, God, like, I'm totally on board with you doing this. Like, what's your plan? He's like, well, I'm going to have you do it.
Right.
And Moses doesn't expect that. And like you said, it's not that he is, wanting to be disrespectful or even unwilling, but he totally feels inadequate for the job, which he probably is, right? At least on his own.
That's the point. I think he is. I think he's inadequate.
Yeah.
And wouldn't you feel inadequate in front of God?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure.
I mean, there's no way I can do this in the manner in which it needs to be done. This is a holy operation. And so, it reminds you of the Church of Philadelphia, and that's one of the things that we've talked about here at the local group. But you think about, though they had little power, this is God. Those with lesser talents, those with lesser ability, those who are younger, right? Let's think about the characters we went back and studied, right? And talked about those who are younger, those who are less, those who are born in a manger, God can work with.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I just think that that's who he is and who he can mold into greatness.
Right. And even on your point about, the young people discounting the young, a lot of times we see people discounting the old and seemingly unsuccessful so far. And that's the position Moses is in right now, right? He's the guy who had it all and then lost it, right? And is no longer a successful person. In the same way, Abraham was an 80-year-old man who should have been on his way to retirement on his family's farm, right? And that's when everything starts for him, right? And so sometimes, no matter what position you're in, to where society or your friends or maybe even yourself are, or you are discounting yourself, right? That's often exactly who God chooses, right, to use. And that's what we see with Moses, despite his hesitancy, because he knows that he's, right, like you said, insufficient. And so God reassures him here in verse 12, I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you when you've brought the people out of Egypt. You shall serve God on this mountain. So he says, hey, like, remember where you are, because I'm bringing you back to this place. And we'll get back to that in another episode here, because that's down the road. But you can tell already God is expanding Moses' mental timeline here. He says, hey, like, I'm sitting on this trip, and he says, I can't do it. He says, no, not only am I sitting on this trip, I'm going to bring you right back to where this all started, and you're going to remember this moment, right? Which he clearly does, because he wrote it down.
God will accomplish what he desires to accomplish. God's will shall be done.
It will. And it's one of those things where, too, a lot of times, and we've talked about this some on the show, but our concept of time is one that God is constantly trying to pull out of the linear, 3 seconds ahead and 3 seconds behind kind of spot that we're in, and show that God is not bound by time, right? In fact, he can see, wherever he wants to across time, however that works. I don't have the scientific brain to explain how that works, but in just saying, hey, there's already a future moment that I know is here where you and Israel are going to be here, is already a sort of reassurance that helps solidify that. And so, and Moses even says in verse 13, then Moses said to God, indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And so already Moses is kind of leaning into, okay, let's talk about how this works.
I need a script.
Right, yeah. When I do, so I'm willing to do it. So when I do, what now? Like, I'll take the job. It's like, walking into your job for the first day and saying, okay, what do I do? And here's a really significant line. It's a line that is very important to the rest of the Bible. Verse 14, and God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus shall you say to the children of Israel, I am sent me to you. And so there's another aspect there that takes God out of time, right? He is, right? He's not just, is over there or is up there, right? He is, right? I am. And so if you look, and just to jump around to where this shows up, spoiler alert for, the New Testament here. In John chapter 8, Jesus is having a debate with the descendants of these people who Moses brings out of Egypt, right?
Right.
And he's having a debate about his identity. And he's basically making the argument to his Jewish audience that they don't recognize him because they no longer recognize God. And the way Moses would have recognized God here at the burning bush, and the way Abraham would have recognized God. And we've talked about Abraham before, and so something the Jews are leaning into here is the fact that Abraham is their father, and so that makes them justified, right? And in verse 56 here of John chapter 8, Jesus says to them, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. Then the Jews said to him, you are not yet 50 years old, and you've seen Abraham? And Jesus said to them, most assuredly I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. Right? And here's that line, that sort of punch to the gut, where they knew exactly what he was talking about. They knew what that name meant, they knew what it referenced, and it goes all the way back to their history of deliverance here, where Jesus identifies himself as I am. And so we see Christ is not only there in the New Testament, but he's explaining to them there that this was me the whole time. I was there.
I was in the bush.
Yeah, exactly. I was the one who delivered you out of Egypt.
Boy, that bothered them. This conversation tonight's not about that group of people. Mm-hmm. But had to be like nails on a chalkboard.
They tried to stone him after that.
But the fact that he just so eloquently, timely, perfectly just said, I am.
Right.
He had probably held on to that bomb for as long as he could, and then he put it on him. But it does speak to this moment, how real this conversation is. It seems strange, like a strange conversation, but it's beyond real in our lives, because this is a conversation with the I am and the created being. And just like you've said, the created being was asked to do a job that they were ill-equipped to do.
Yeah.
But he became mightily equipped to conquer the job and accomplish the job because God was there with him. And thanks be to God that this can be my story.
Oh, yeah.
That though I'm inadequate, he is faithful and he can provide, and the I am is with me. So this is a beautiful story.
It is.
And again, you look at the value of this character conversation, even in the way that God introduced himself to Moses in this moment to kind of get to the point that I'm the I am. He says, well, I'm the God of a person. I'm the God of Abraham. You remember the character study on him? I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And he introduced, and then he would later be known as the God of Moses. And so it's beautiful to see this. And I think that, what we need to take from this conversation tonight is just accept that we're inadequate, accept that we're powerless in many ways, but he's faithful and he's in control. So thank you for guiding us through this conversation, really the one with the I am.
Yeah.
So thanks a lot. Appreciate you guys tuning into this conversation and this monumental story in the biblical narrative. So y'all be well until next time. Thanks.